The silence was so heavy Grace Vaughn could almost touch it. 3 days since they had laid Thomas in the ground, and the emptiness of the ranch house on the outskirts of Yuba City, California, threatened to swallow her whole. The spring of 1878 had arrived with wildflowers blooming across the Sierra foothills, but inside her heart, winter still raged. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the tears away. They'd been married barely a year before consumption took him. Just enough time to fall in love with this stretch of land along the Feather River, enough time to plan a future that would never come. Thomas had bought the ranch with money saved from 5 years of hard work in the silver mines. Now she was alone with 20 acres, a small herd of cattle, and a house that echoed with every footstep. She moved to the window, gazing at the setting sun painting the distant mountains gold and crimson. 22 years old and a widow. The thought still didn't feel real. Her fingers absently twisted the plain gold band on her left hand. In the yard, the chickens scratched in their pen, oblivious to her grief. The cattle would need tending soon. Life continued, even when it seemed impossible. A movement at the edge of the property caught her eye. A rider approached slowly, his hat pulled low against the fading sunlight. Grace tensed. Visitors had been scarce since the funeral, most folks in Yuba City giving her space to mourn. This rider wasn't familiar, tall in the saddle with broad shoulders, leading a pack horse behind him. She reached for Thomas's shotgun, propped beside the door. Women alone on the frontier were vulnerable, and while Yuba City was more civilized than some parts of the West, caution was second nature. The stranger dismounted at the edge of her yard, tethering both horses to the hitching post. Grace watched as he removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. He looked up at the house, seeming to hesitate. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude." Grace opened the door but remained in the threshold, the shotgun visible but not raised. "State your business, mister." The man kept a respectful distance. "Name's Isaac Lawson, madam. I worked with your husband in the Silver Peak mines before he bought this place. I've been up north the past 2 years, just heard about Thomas." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss." Grace studied him. He appeared to be in his late 20s, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. She vaguely recalled Thomas mentioning in Isaac a friend who'd taught him guitar during the long evenings after mining shifts. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice sounding strange to her own ears after days of barely speaking. "Did you ride all this way just to offer condolences?" Isaac shook his head. "Thomas once told me if I ever needed work, he'd have a place for me. I know that offer likely died with him, but I thought—" He glanced at the neglected corral, the cattle that needed attention. "I thought perhaps you might need a hand around here, at least for a spell. No strings attached, madam, just to help out an old friend's widow." Grace hesitated. She did need help. The ranch was too much for one person, especially one who'd grown up in Sacramento and was still learning the ways of ranch life. But taking on a stranger seemed risky. "You can check my references in town," Isaac added, as if reading her thoughts. "Sheriff Ramsey knows me. I worked honest jobs all through the territory." "I have little money to pay wages," Grace admitted. "Room and board would be fair enough to start," Isaac replied. "And if you decide you don't need my help after a week, I'll move along, no hard feelings." After a long moment, Grace nodded. "There's a small cabin beyond the barn. It needs airing out, but you can stay there. We'll try a week." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you, madam. I'll see to my horses and then tend to whatever needs doing most." Grace watched him lead his horses toward the barn, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But the alternative, facing another night in the silence of her grief, seemed suddenly unbearable. As darkness fell, Grace lit the lamps and prepared a simple supper. She hesitated, then set 2 plates on the table. Minutes later, a knock sounded at the door. "Pardon me, Mrs. Vaughn," Isaac said, hat in hand. "I've unsaddled my horses and checked your cattle. They're all accounted for, though your fence on the north pasture could use some work. I can start on that tomorrow." "Thank you," Grace replied. "I've made supper if you'd care to join me." Surprise flickered across his face. "That's mighty kind." "I wouldn't want to intrude on your grief." "The silence is worse," she admitted before she could stop herself. "Please, I'd welcome the company, just for supper." Isaac nodded, carefully wiping his boots before entering. He washed his hands at the basin and took a seat at the table, waiting for Grace to sit first. His manners were better than she'd expected from a drifting ranch hand. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a different quality of quiet, less oppressive than what had filled the house before. After the meal, Isaac thanked her and excused himself to the cabin, promising to begin work at first light. True to his word, Grace woke to the sound of hammering. From her window, she could see Isaac repairing the chicken coop that had been damaged in the last storm. Thomas had meant to fix it weeks ago, before the coughing had worsened and confined him to bed. Over the next few days, Isaac proved himself invaluable. He mended fences, mucked stalls, chopped firewood, and tended the cattle with quiet efficiency. He took his noon meals with Grace, but spent evenings in the cabin, giving her space. She found herself watching the clock as midday approached, the shared meals becoming the only time the crushing loneliness abated. On the fifth evening, as twilight settled over the ranch, Grace sat on the porch trying to mend one of Thomas's shirts. She wasn't sure why she bothered there was no one to wear it now, but her hands needed occupation. The tears came suddenly, hot and unwelcome. She had thought she was cried out, but grief had its own timetable. Soft notes drifted through the evening air. Grace looked up, wiping her eyes. Near the cabin, Isaac sat on an overturned crate, a guitar in his lap. The melody was gentle, melancholy, but somehow soothing. He didn't sing, just played. His head bent over the instrument as his fingers coaxed out a tune that seemed to give voice to her sadness. Grace set aside her mending and simply listened. The music filled the spaces between her heartbeats, between her breaths. For the first time since the funeral, the silence wasn't crushing her. When the last notes faded, she realized she'd been holding her breath. Isaac looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. Neither spoke. He nodded once, then began another song, this one with a slightly more hopeful tone. The next morning at breakfast, Grace said, "Thank you for the music." Isaac looked up from his coffee, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Thomas and I used to play together in the mining camps. He was better than me." "I never heard him play," Grace said softly. "We were just getting to know each other, really. A year isn't very long." "No, madam, it isn't." Isaac hesitated. "If it brought you any comfort, I'd be happy to play again. Sometimes when words fail, music speaks." That evening, and each one that followed, Isaac would bring his guitar outside after the day's work was done. Sometimes he sat near the cabin, sometimes closer to the main house. Grace would listen from the porch, the melodies washing over her like gentle rain on parched earth. As the days stretched into weeks, she began to notice other things about Isaac beyond his work ethic and music, the way sunlight caught the flecks of amber in his hazel eyes. How he always ensured she had fresh water from the well each morning before she woke. The careful distance he maintained, never presuming familiarity despite their daily interactions. A month after Isaac's arrival, Grace ventured into Yuba City for supplies. Mrs. Tolliver at the general store gave her a knowing look. "That Lawson fellow still working your ranch?" she asked, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Yes," Grace replied, keeping her tone neutral. "He's been a great help." Mrs. Tolliver raised an eyebrow. "Folks are talking, you know. Young widow, single man living on the property." Heat rushed to Grace's face. "Mr. Lawson stays in the cabin. He's been nothing but respectful." "I'm sure he has," Mrs. Tolliver said, not unkindly. "But you might want to consider your reputation, dear. Perhaps hire the Wilkins boy to help instead. He's young enough that tongues wouldn't wag." Grace straightened her spine. "Mr. Lawson knew my husband. He's helping me honor Thomas's memory by keeping the ranch running. I don't much care what people say." But she did care, she realized as she drove the wagon home. Not about the gossip itself, but about the implication that she was somehow betraying Thomas's memory. Was finding comfort in Isaac's presence, in his music, a form of disloyalty to her dead husband? That evening, when Isaac brought out his guitar, Grace descended from the porch and walked across the yard. His fingers stilled on the strings as she approached. "Mrs. Vaughn?" "Please, call me Grace," she said, surprising herself. "After all this time, formality seems unnecessary." A small smile touched his lips. "Grace? Then, is something troubling you?" She sank onto the edge of a nearby stump. "People in town are talking about you being here." Understanding crossed his face. "I see. Would you prefer I moved on? I wouldn't want to cause you any distress." "No," she said quickly. "That is, I don't want you to leave. But I realize today that I know very little about you, beyond your friendship with Thomas. Isaac set the guitar aside. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "Where you're from, where you learned to play, why you never settled down, why you really came here." He was quiet for a long moment. "I was born in Ohio. My father was a schoolteacher who loved music. He taught me to play when I was 7. When he died, my mother couldn't keep the family together. I ended up working on riverboats, then headed west when I was 20. Been wandering ever since. And why here? Why now?" Isaac's gaze was steady. "Thomas saved my life once, in the mines. Cave in. He could have run, but he came back for me. I owed him." He paused. "When I heard he'd died, leaving behind a young wife, I felt I owed it to him to make sure you were all right." "And that's the only reason?" Grace pressed. His eyes held hers. "At first, yes, but now I stay because the work suits me, because this land gets under your skin, because—" He hesitated. "Because your strength amazes me, Grace Vaughn. And because sometimes, when I play and you listen, I feel like the music matters." Something shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. Grace stood, suddenly aware of the deepening darkness in their solitude. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "And for the music, especially for the music." She returned to the house, her heart beating too fast. That night she dreamed of Thomas, but for the first time, the dream wasn't painful. He was smiling, playing a guitar she'd never seen him touch in life, the melody familiar one of Isaac's tunes. The following Sunday, Grace made a decision. "I'd like to attend church services today," she announced at breakfast. She hadn't been since the funeral. "Would you accompany me?" Surprise registered on Isaac's face. "Are you certain? People will talk even more." "Let them," Grace said with new resolve. "I'm a widow, not dead myself. I need to rejoin the living sometime." They rode into Yuba City together, Grace in her best black dress, Isaac in a clean shirt with his hair neatly combed. The stairs were immediate as they entered the small white church, but Grace held her head high. After the service, Isaac stood respectfully at her side as neighbors offered belated condolences, some with curious glances at her companion. Sheriff Ramsey approached, nodding to both of them. "Mrs. Vaughn, good to see you back in town. Lawson, keeping out of trouble?" "Trying to, Sheriff," Isaac replied with a slight smile. "He's been a tremendous help with the ranch," Grace added. The sheriff's weathered face softened. "Thomas would be glad to know you weren't alone, madam. He worried about you managing that place by yourself." His words eased something inside Grace. Perhaps having Isaac there wasn't betraying Thomas's memory, but honoring his concern for her welfare. As summer stretched toward autumn, the rhythm of ranch life continued. Isaac proved adept at everything from breaking horses to negotiating cattle prices with the buyers who came through. The ranch began to prosper under their joint efforts. Each evening, his music filled the air, and each day, Grace felt her grief lightening, not vanishing, but transforming into something she could carry without breaking. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch after supper, Isaac said, "I've been thinking about building onto the barn. Winter's coming, and we could use more covered space for hay storage." Grace noticed his use of "we" rather than "you," as if he saw himself as part of the ranch's future. The thought warmed her. "That sounds sensible," she replied. "Do you plan to stay through winter then?" Isaac set down his coffee cup, his expression turning serious. "I'd like to stay as long as you'll have me, Grace. I know I came here because of Thomas, but I've grown to care about this place, and about you." The admission hung between them, honest but careful, respecting boundaries neither had dared cross. "I've come to rely on you," Grace said softly. "More than I should, perhaps." "Is that such a bad thing, relying on someone?" "I relied on Thomas, and he was taken from me." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm afraid, Isaac. Afraid of caring too much and losing again." Isaac reached across the space between their chairs, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Fear is natural, but so is hope. I can't promise what tomorrow brings, but I can promise that today, right now, I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to leave." Grace's fingers moved those last few inches, touching his. The contact was brief but electric. She withdrew her hand, not yet ready for more, but feeling something unfurl inside her possibility. The next day brought unexpected trouble. Grace was working in the vegetable garden when she heard shouting from the pasture. She ran toward the sound to find Isaac confronting 3 men on horseback. "This is private property," Isaac was saying, his stance wide and defensive. You need to move along. This land belongs to the Vaughn widow, the largest of the men replied, a heavy-set individual with a bushy beard. And word is, she's looking to sell. We're just examining our potential investment. Grace hurried forward. I'm Mrs. Vaughn, and I'm certainly not selling. Who told you otherwise? The men exchanged glances. Fellow in town said you couldn't manage the place alone, that you'd be looking to unload it cheap before winter. That fellow was mistaken, Grace said firmly. This ranch is not for sale at any price. The bearded man's expression hardened. Shame to see good land wasted on a woman. Your husband wouldn't want— My husband, Grace cut in, wanted this to be our home, and it is my home. Now, as my foreman said, you're trespassing. Isaac moved slightly closer to Grace, his hand not far from the revolver at his hip. After a tense moment, the men turned their horses. Think about it, Mrs. Vaughn, the bearded one called over his shoulder. Winter's coming, and running cattle ain't women's work. We'll give you a fair price. When they were out of sight, Grace's composure cracked. Foreman, is that what you are? Isaac looked abashed. I thought it sounded better than hired hand. Might make them take us more seriously. Us, she repeated softly. I meant you and the ranch, he clarified quickly. Grace shook her head, a small smile forming despite her lingering anger at the intruders. I knew what you meant, Isaac, and thank you for standing with me. That evening, when Isaac played, his music had a protective quality, like a barrier against the outside world and its threats. Grace sat closer than usual, drawn to the comfort of his presence. The next day, they rode into town together to speak with Sheriff Ramsey about the trespassers. The lawman promised to keep an eye out for the men, but warned that land speculators were getting more aggressive throughout the county. You might want to consider their offer, Mrs. Vaughn, he said, not unkindly. Running a ranch alone is hard enough for a man, for a widow. She's not alone, Isaac interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. And she's more capable than most men I know. The sheriff studied them both, understanding dawning in his eyes. I see. Well then, I'll make sure those fellas understand the property isn't available. As they left the sheriff's office, Grace felt a new resolve. Thank you for what you said in there, Isaac shrugged. I only spoke the truth. You've amazed me every day with your determination, Grace. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted further down the street. A wagon had overturned, and a crowd was gathering. They hurried toward the scene, where a man was trapped beneath a heavy vehicle. Get some men on the other side, someone shouted. We need to lift it together. Isaac immediately joined the effort, positioning himself at the front corner of the wagon. Grace watched as he and 7 other men strained to lift the massive weight. The trapped man was pulled free, bloodied, but alive. As the doctor was summoned, Grace found herself staring at Isaac, his strength, his unhesitating response to someone in need. Something shifted in her heart, a recognition she'd been fighting for months. That night, after supper, they sat in companionable silence on the porch. The evening was cool, autumn approaching in earnest. Isaac hadn't brought out his guitar yet. I never thanked Thomas, Grace said suddenly. Isaac looked at her questioningly. For bringing me here, she clarified. I was a city girl. He brought me to this wild, beautiful place. I hated it at first, the isolation, the work, the hardships. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. He chose well, Isaac said. This land suits you. As it suits you, she replied. I've watched you these past months. You belong here as much as I do. Isaac's eyes held hers. Are you offering me a permanent position, Mrs. Vaughn? The formality made her smile. I might be. Would you accept? Depends on the terms, he said, his voice low. Grace gathered her courage. I can't offer much in wages, but there's a place here for you. Not just as a hired hand, not just as a foreman. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Grace, I don't want you to feel obligated or rushed. Your grief is still with me, she finished for him. It always will be in some form. But Thomas would want me to live, Isaac. And when I hear your music, when I see you work this land with the same love I feel for it, I want to live again. Isaac moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. I've been falling in love with you since the first night I played for you. But I swore I wouldn't speak of it, wouldn't pressure you. You never did, Grace whispered. You just played your music and let me find my own way back to feeling. His hand rose to touch her cheek gently. May I court you properly, Grace Vaughn? with the understanding that I respect what you had with Thomas, that I would never try to replace those memories? Grace leaned into his touch. I would like that very much. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, laden with promise rather than passion. When they parted, Isaac retrieved his guitar and played a new melody, one that spoke not of grief, but of new beginnings. Word spread quickly through Yuba City that Isaac Lawson was courting the widow Vaughn. Some tongues wagged, but many more nodded in approval, especially those who had worried about Grace managing alone. Isaac moved from the cabin to the small room off the kitchen that had once been meant for the children Thomas and Grace had planned to have. Their courtship was proper but warm, filled with shared work, music under the stars, and gradually increasing displays of affection. As winter descended, bringing rain and occasional snow to the Sierra foothills, the ranch house became a haven. Isaac expanded the barn as planned and added improvements to the house, a larger stone hearth, better sealed windows, a covered walkway from the back door to the well. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after a simple but special supper, Isaac set aside his guitar and reached into his pocket. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, suddenly nervous. He withdrew a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. "I made this. The box, I mean." Grace's heart quickened as she took it from him. Inside nestled a ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it. "It's not fancy," Isaac said apologetically, "but the pearl reminded me of your strength, something beautiful created from difficulty." "It's perfect," Grace whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I love you, Grace Vaughn. I love your courage, your determination, your heart. I love the way you listen when I play. Like the music means something precious. I love working beside you on this land." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Grace slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she said simply. "With all my heart, yes." They were married in the spring of 1879, when the wildflowers carpeted the ranch and the cattle had new calves gambling in the pastures. The ceremony was small but joyful, held on their own land under an arch Isaac had constructed from saplings. Sheriff Ramsey stood as witness, along with a few neighbors who had become friends. Even Mrs. Tolliver attended, smiling approvingly as the couple exchanged vows. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, Isaac pulled Grace close. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Deeply," she assured him. "I never expected to find love twice in my life. I feel blessed beyond measure." "As do I," he kissed her softly. "I have a wedding gift for you." "Another?" The new cook stove was more than generous. Isaac smiled. This one didn't cost anything but time. He led her inside to where his guitar waited by the fire. "I've been working on this for months." He began to play, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, Isaac sang. His voice was rich and deep, the melody hauntingly beautiful. The song told of loss and loneliness, of music in the darkness, of healing and hope reborn. It was their story, set to the notes that had first breached the walls of her grief. When the final chord faded, Grace was weeping openly. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Isaac set the guitar aside and took her in his arms. "You gave me a home, Grace, a purpose, a love I never thought I'd find. The music is just my poor attempt to thank you." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered new harmonies together, their bodies finding the same sweet synchronicity that their hearts had already achieved. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The winter of 1880 was brutal, forcing them to bring weakened cattle into the barn to nurse them through the worst storms. The spring of 1881 brought flooding that washed out fences and threatened their crops. But there were triumphs, too. Their herd grew stronger under careful management. Isaac's skill with horses brought buyers from as far as Sacramento, willing to pay premium prices for his well-trained stock. Grace's vegetable garden expanded into a small orchard. And in the summer of 1882, their family grew as well. William Thomas Lawson arrived after a difficult labor, his lusty cries filling the ranch house as dawn broke over the mountains. Isaac, who had paced the porch all night, playing his guitar between bouts of anxious prayer, wept openly when the midwife placed his son in his arms. "He has your eyes," Isaac told Grace as she cradled their newborn. "And your chin," she replied, tracing the baby's tiny features. Thomas would be so happy for us." Isaac nodded, understanding as always. Thomas's memory remained honored in their home, his photograph still displayed, his name now carried by their son. Grace's first love was not forgotten or diminished by her second, merely woven into the tapestry of their shared life. William grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's love of music and his mother's determination. Isaac carved him a small wooden whistle, which the boy carried everywhere. Their days fell into a pleasant rhythm of work and family, punctuated by Isaac's evening music sessions on the porch. In 1884, their daughter Elizabeth Grace joined the family, completing their happiness. Isaac composed a special lullaby for her, which became her nightly request as she grew old enough to speak. By 1885, the ranch had nearly doubled in size as they purchased adjacent properties when they became available. The original 20 acres had grown to almost 50, with improved pastures, a larger barn, and a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands they now employed during the busier seasons. Grace, now approaching 30, had blossomed from the grief-stricken widow into a confident woman known throughout the county for her fine cattle and her generous spirit. She and Isaac often hosted community gatherings, with his music drawing folks from miles around. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, as the children slept soundly, Isaac and Grace sat on the porch swing he had built the previous summer. His guitar rested against the wall, momentarily silent as they watched the stars emerge. "Do you ever wonder," Grace asked, her head on his shoulder, "what would have happened if you hadn't come that day? If you hadn't brought your music when I couldn't bear the quiet?" Isaac's arm tightened around her. "I try not to think of it. The idea of never knowing you, never having Will and Lizzie, never finding this place to belong, it's too painful to contemplate." "I was so lost," Grace whispered. "The silence was crushing me. Your music, it gave me permission to feel again, to breathe. And you gave me a reason to stay in one place, to put down roots after years of drifting." Isaac kissed her temple. "I think perhaps we saved each other." Grace nodded against his shoulder. "Will asked me yesterday about his name about Thomas. I showed him the photograph and told him about his brave uncle who loved this land. 'You did right,' Isaac said. 'Our children should know all their heritage.' I told him how Thomas brought me here, how he taught me to love this wild country, and then how you came with your guitar and taught me to love again." Grace looked up at her husband, the starlight silvering his features. "It's a good story, isn't it? One worth passing down?" "The best story," Isaac agreed, "and we're still writing it every day." He reached for his guitar and began to play softly, the melody a familiar one, the first song he'd ever played for her, now transformed from a lament into a celebration. Grace closed her eyes and listened, thinking of the quiet after the funeral and how this man's music had filled it, note by note, until silence no longer meant emptiness, but possibility. As the melody wove through the night air, Grace reflected on the journey from grief to joy. The ranch had flourished under their joint stewardship, becoming one of the most prosperous in the county. Their children were healthy and happy, and the love that had grown between them, cautious at first, then steadily stronger, was now the bedrock of their existence. "Play the children's favorite," she requested as the first song ended, the one about the journey west. Isaac smiled and obliged, his fingers finding the lively tune that always made William and Elizabeth dance around the parlor. Grace hummed along, thinking of her own journey not across the country, but through sorrow into happiness. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Isaac whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Grace asked, drowsy and content. "For listening. That first night when I played outside. You could have sent me away. The music called to me," she said simply. "It was like a lifeline when I was drowning." Isaac pulled her closer. "I'll always play for you, Grace, every day of our lives." And he did. Through the years that followed, through droughts and abundant harvests, through their children's growth and eventual departures to pursue their own dreams, through the inevitable losses and countless joys of a life fully lived, Isaac's music remained constant. Each evening, weather permitting, he would sit on the porch and play, with Grace beside him, their hands occasionally touching between songs. Folks in Yuba City came to see their ranch as not just a successful business, but a testament to resilience and second chances. Young couples sought their advice, widows found comfort in Grace's understanding, drifters occasionally stayed to work, drawn by Isaac's example of a wanderer who had found home. In the spring of 1899, as the century approached its end, they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought both their children home, William from his law practice in Sacramento with his young wife, and Elizabeth from her teaching position in San Francisco. The ranch hands built long tables under the old oak trees, and neighbors brought dishes to share. As twilight descended, Isaac brought out his guitar, now worn smooth from decades of playing. "A special song for my wife," he announced to the assembled guests, his hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes as warm as ever when they rested on Grace. "The first one I wrote for her, all those years ago." The familiar melody filled the evening air, and Grace closed her eyes, transported back to that first night when music had penetrated her grief. So much had changed. So much had been built and grown and nurtured since then. Yet the essence remained the healing power of love, expressed through music, the comfort of finding someone who understood both joy and sorrow. When the song ended, the gathered friends and family applauded, but Grace simply reached for Isaac's hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. No words were necessary between them. Their story was written in every fence post of the ranch, every laugh of their children, every note of music that had filled the once unbearable silence. As their guests departed and the night deepened, Isaac and Grace stood on their porch, arms around each other, gazing at the stars that had witnessed their journey. "Still happy, Mrs. Lawson?" Isaac asked, the question a familiar ritual between them. Grace smiled up at him, the lines around her eyes speaking of years of both laughter and tears, all part of a life richly lived. "More than I ever dreamed possible." "And you, Mr. Lawson? Any regrets about staying with a grief-stricken widow all those years ago?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he replied, bending to kiss her softly. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, witnesses to the enduring power of music to heal, of love to transform, and of courage to begin again when all seems lost. On the porch of the ranch house they had built together, Isaac Lawson held his wife close and hummed softly, adding one more note to the melody of their shared life, a song that had begun in sorrow but had grown into a symphony of joy.